4, 3, 2. The Holocaust was a systematic, bureaucratic, and state-sponsored program to completely exterminate the Jewish people, not only within the so-called Third Reich, but throughout the European continent at large. In 1933, the Jewish population of Europe stood at over 9 million, with most Jews living in countries that Nazi Germany would occupy or otherwise influence during World War II. By 1945, the Germans and their collaborators had killed nearly 2 out of every 3 European Jews. Holocaust is just one word for what happened, and it comes from the Greek word for sacrifice by fire. Another name for this historical event is Shoah, from the Yiddish word for catastrophe. And for the Jewish people, this truly was an unprecedented catastrophe that would forever define them. For the rest of the world, the Holocaust remains one of the most significant events of our modern day. Like the French Revolution, it represents a civilizational rupture between the world which existed before and the one that came after. In the words of Norman Naimark, the Holocaust has become the dominant historical metaphor of our time. More than any other event, it demonstrates the limits of progress and the moral bankruptcy of Western civilization. At the same time, the Holocaust is also the ultimate example of a past that remains incomprehensible and thus impossible to capture. Some historians, most notably Saul Friedlander, have accepted this strangeness of the past, constructing a detailed narrative of the Holocaust while simultaneously cultivating what he calls that historical sensation of disbelief. But is the Holocaust uniquely incomprehensible? Is it exceptionally strange? It was not the only instance of 20th century genocide, before, during, or most obviously, after the Second World War. It was not even the first time that the Germans tried to eliminate an entire people. In 1904, the Herero people of German Southwest Africa rebelled against their colonial overlords, attacking German farms and killing around 150 German settlers. This prompted Kaiser Wilhelm II to send 14,000 troops to the colony. After defeating their foes in battle, the German command gave the Herero people an ultimatum: leave the territory as defined by the Germans or be killed. When many of the Herero retreated into the Kalahari Desert, the German troops cut them off from food and water supplies, leading to mass death through dehydration and starvation, before the survivors ended up in concentration camps. Rough estimates of the number of Herero killed run as high as 65,000, or 80% of the population. 10 years after the destruction of the Herero people in Southwest Africa, the German government watched as their new ally, the Turks, systematically exterminated the Christian Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire. In the midst of the First World War, the Ottoman government developed a two-part strategy. First, they ordered healthy Armenian men to join labor battalions, forcing them to work themselves to death, literally. Then the government rounded up Armenian women, children, and seniors and forced them onto death marches to concentration camps in the Syrian desert. Along the way, Turkish soldiers denied the deportees food, water, and tortured, raped, and mutilated indiscriminately. In 1915, the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire stood at about 2 million. In 1923, when the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed, the entire Armenian population had disappeared, with up to 1.5 million dying at the hands of Turkish soldiers and civilians. These massacres were common knowledge in interwar Germany, and after 1933, persecuted Jews frequently alluded to the Armenian Genocide, suggesting that the same thing might happen to them under Nazi rule. The Jews were right, but they were not the Nazis' only targets during the Second World War. Racial enemies of the Nazi regime included the Russians, the Poles, and the Romani, also known as the Gypsies, while the list of ideological and asocial adversaries included socialists, Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and criminals. Meanwhile, other authoritarian regimes used the cover of the Second World War to try their hand at ethnic cleansing. The Soviets, for example, forcibly removed the Chechen and Ingush people from their homelands in the North Caucasus. Accusing these Muslim minorities of collaborating with the Nazis, they showed no mercy. In one particularly violent episode in 1944, Soviet troops drove 730 villagers into a barn, lit it on fire, and shot anyone who tried to escape. 3,000 Chechens died before the deportations commenced, while up to 100,000 died in total. 2 years before World War II even started in Europe, the Japanese army brutally sacked the nationalist capital of China, raping, torturing, and murdering up to 300,000 Chinese civilians. Over the course of 6 horrendous weeks in late 1937, live burials, castrations, and human bayonet practice became common occurrences. In a controversial book by journalist Iris Chang, she provocatively refers to the Rape of Nanjing as the forgotten Holocaust of World War II. As was the case in Central and Eastern Europe, racism, militarism, competition for resources, and the brutalization of total war set the stage for this explosion of violence. It was during the closing years of the Second World War that Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish emigre, coined the term genocide to describe what Winston Churchill had once referred to as the crime without a name. According to Lemkin, genocide was, quote, the use of deliberate, systematic measures such as killing, bodily or mental injury, unlivable conditions, and prevention of births calculated to bring about the extermination of a racial, political, or cultural group, or to destroy the language, religion, or culture of a group, end quote. After the war, Lemkin appealed to the representatives of the newly formed United Nations to adopt the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which they finally did in 1948. Until his death in 1959, he worked to educate both policymakers and the public about this modern scourge of genocide. His efforts appear to have been in vain. A 2003 article in the American Political Review contains a list of 37 cases of genocide that occurred between 1955 and 2001, with the greatest death tolls in Pakistan, Cambodia, and Rwanda. In total, up to 60 million men, women, and children were victims of genocide during the 20th century, and the new century, to use the words of James Waller, social psychologist and expert in genocide, brings little light to the darkness. Still, some scholars continue to insist on the uniqueness of the Holocaust by emphasizing several different factors, including the systematic character of the final solution, the central role of the death camps, and the Nazis' obsessive determination to rid the world of the Jewish people. Perhaps the best illustration of this systematic character is the Wannsee Conference of January 1942. In a luxurious villa outside of Berlin, representatives of various government agencies and Nazi organizations sat down and talked about the final solution to the so-called Jewish question. The minutes of the conference are rife with euphemisms and the passive voice. They do not openly describe the killing program, but everyone knew what Reinhard Heydrich meant when he said that the Jews who survived forced labor would have to be dealt with appropriately. In other words, the German government coordinated a policy aimed at the systematic annihilation of an entire people through forced labor, brutality, and murder. In this sense, it is very similar to the plan coordinated by the Ottoman government in 1915. After the Wannsee Conference, the Nazis and their allies shipped Jews from occupied territories to one of 6 extermination camps in Poland. Surely, the death camps distinguished the Holocaust from other cases of genocide. For the victims, places like Auschwitz-Birkenau were truly hell on earth, a netherworld of degradation, dehumanization, and sheer horror removed from ordinary reality. However, an emphasis on the unique experience of the extermination camps really obscures the experiences of the Jews who died in face-to-face encounters outside of the camps. Indeed, much of the slaughter that took place between 1939 and 1945 was not industrialized, it wasn't routine, it wasn't anonymous. Instead, it was messy, it was crude, and it was personal, just like it was in Rwanda and Cambodia before that. The objective behind the slaughter was the total eradication of the Jewish people. And this was something unique about the Holocaust. The Nazis did not want to simply ethnically cleanse Germany. They wanted to make all of Europe, and eventually the world, free of Jews. How else are we to explain the June 1944 deportation of 1,800 Jews from the remote Greek island of Corfu? They were not a military threat, nor did they occupy valuable living space, what the Germans called Lebensraum. They were simply Jews. Yes, the Nazis targeted other groups, but the National Socialist ideology did not require their total disappearance. This is unique. But does an emphasis on the Jewish experience eclipse the suffering of millions of other victims? Does it downplay the fact that the Nazi regime, like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia or the Guatemalan government during that country's 30-year civil war, chose its victims based on ethnic and political rationale? And yet, the Holocaust remains categorically different from these cases, and not just in the ways already mentioned. Unlike other genocides, the Holocaust was an international affair. It took place throughout Europe. The Nazis relied on the assistance of non-Germans, including Ukrainians, Latvians, and Lithuanians who aided the mobile killing squads, not to mention the Polish civilians that spontaneously murdered their Jewish neighbors as Nazi soldiers stood by and watched. Something else that distinguishes the Holocaust is the enormous amount of scholarship dedicated to the subject. No less than 100,000 books, articles, and essays have been written about the final solution. In other words, we know far more about this case of genocide than any other, past or present. Still, there's a real danger in regarding the Holocaust as a singular event. It elevates Jewish suffering above that of other groups, while also implying that this sort of thing happened only once, over 70 years ago. As scholars, and as human beings, we should not be reluctant to compare the Holocaust with other cases of genocide. But I should emphasize, comparison need not imply equivalencies, judgment, or absolution. In the 1980s, a well-respected German historian named Ernst Nolte wrote a book in which he argued that the Nazis feared that the Soviet terror would be used against them, and consequently, subsequently, implemented the final solution as a sort of preemptive defense. In a sense, Nolte implied that the Soviet gulags were the original and greater crime. This unleashed a controversy in Germany known as the Historikerstreit, as left-wing intellectuals accused Nolte and other historians of trying to whitewash and trivialize the Holocaust. But Nolte, like other historians before and after, simply sought to make the unbelievable more comprehensible, which returns us to one of my earlier points. Can we ever truly understand this unmasterable past? A student of mine once wrote, quote, "No matter how many times we try to rationalize what happened and fit all the pieces of the historical puzzle in all the right places, no excuse or explanation will ever be able to make sense of the sheer madness of it all." End quote. I think John is correct, but maybe we can approach comprehension via comparison. Maybe we have more to gain by considering similarities than we do by insisting on uniqueness. And even if we disagree about some points, at least we're talking about it.